Welcome to Mysterious Goings On. We're going to get right to the show after these messages.
This is Maddie Dalrymple, the author of the Anne Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts, and you're listening to Mysterious Goings On.
You know, it's my favorite time of the year, and if you're any kind of a regular listener to Mysterious Goings On, you know that I adore fall, but I particularly adore the spooky season, the Halloween season. Actually, though, I enjoy Halloween all the way through New Year's, and I'll tell you, because I think the whole season is one of ghosts, because think about it, even if it's not a actual, non-corporeal entity haunting you, I think at the end of the year, we all face our ghosts, don't we? We all think about the previous year. We think about all these things from our past that, haunt us in one way or another. And that's why I love this season. And I'm very excited to have a author who elicits a lot of that feeling with me. He is James Morgan Jones, and he is the author of the Glasswater Quintet. It's a series of novels linked by character and location, but set in different decades from the last century up to the present day. Now, the sequence begins with On the Edge of Wild Water. And that's there's 4 of the 5 books are currently published. And he says they're best perhaps described as psychological thrillers with a supernatural slant. He's also written a volume of short stories and a volume of poetry. Over lockdown, he's produced a second short story volume as well as his first play, and is now launched into the final installment of the Glasswater Quintet, as we mentioned, the Ice Chandelier. I am looking forward to being chilled by this Ice Chandelier in our discussion with author James Morgan Jones. Sir, welcome to Mysterious Goings On.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
It's lovely to have you. I am a sucker for thrillers, but I like thrillers that have a little bit of that supernatural bent to them.
Yes.
I would love to jump right in and ask you something. Has anything ever happened in your life that you can point to that drew you to writing about things like this?
I've always been fascinated, as I suppose a lot of children are, by the supernatural and by the darker side of the imagination. I was a shocker as a child. I remember being babysat by my grandmother, and she had been given strict instructions not to let me watch Psycho, which was showing on television that night. Luckily for me, she fell asleep. So I watched Psycho pretty well on my own at 10. And that had another film that impressed me inordinately, and in fact I watched it again quite recently, and it's lost none of its power. It's an adaptation from about 1960, about the same time as Psycho, actually, of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James.
Henry James,
yes. But it's actually called The Innocents, with Deborah Carr in the lead role, and it's the most wonderful adaptation of the story. And even as a child, it's immensly chilling. And what I loved most about it was that ambivalence about it. The psychology of the governess as the central figure. Kate was translated beautifully into the film, and you're never sure whether the spectres that she sees are actually there, whether the children are possessed by them, or whether it's the product of her neurosis. And that always fascinated me, even as a child. I don't know why. Rather than the usual sort of comic strip, ghosts and that kind of thing, that didn't really interest me. It was the psychological haunting of the mind, I think, that gripped me so much.
Well, and funny enough, the Bly House from Turn of the Screw, I mean, it's basically the cautionary tale of don't be a babysitter in a horror story.
Yes. Oh yes, but it's the classiest in that genre, I think, that's ever been written. So there you go. That started it, really. Have I ever had? I suppose what you meant was, had I ever had any supernatural experiences? Actually, I had one which was strange not that long ago when I was researching for the Glasswater Quintet. I went on a Sunday to a local in West Wales. I live in West Wales, and so some of the churches, it's very rural, and some of the churches are very old and very tiny. And I went there on a Sunday in May partly because the bluebells were in bloom in the graveyard below, and it was so beautiful. And as I approached the church, and these are so small that there aren't regular services because the congregations aren't big enough. So that very often there isn't actually anything happening on a Sunday. And I approached the church from where you could, the door of which you can see the bluebell wood. And so, and I heard this faint singing inside, and I thought, oh, they're the congregation, there's a service in progress, and had this ridiculous thought that I didn't want them to see me lurking about outside. But they then realised that the windows were too high, so that didn't bother me. Anyway, I stood there looking at the bluebells, and in the end decided I ought to go before they started filing out. And as I walked away, I thought, this is really strange because it's so rural. People drive to the church. There were no cars whatsoever. And when I got back, I was so bothered by this. There was not a soul to be seen outside or anywhere near, no car, no vehicle, that I actually telephoned somebody I knew lived in the parish and who had keys to the church. And I said, was there a service today? And they said, no. There's been nothing going on today. And there was this judge, very, very formal, singing going on inside. And she said, could it have been just somebody, I don't know, practicing or something? I said, no, it was a congregation. So this was very strange because it was while I was researching the Glasswater Quintet, and particularly on the edge of Wad Water, which does feature sections which takes us back to the 19th century in this area. So it was a very curious incident. I can't say that it was definitely supernatural, but it was strange. So.
I don't know. I'm going to lean towards that. Well, you try to go with Occam's razor, right? Could it have been a recording that went off somehow? But
but it's so unlikely. Actually, is so unlikely. Yes, I mean, if you could see this location, it's really quite remote, and a tiny church in a tiny village. So
I wondered about that when I read up on you, James. Is that how much of the place, where you are, now it's off. I think it's kind of a trope that, of course, the culture of the United Kingdom, the culture of Wales, is so much, in human terms, so much older than America, of course, because you all see something and we say, hey, look, you're visiting America, you're in Lexington and Concord, that's a 250-year-old house, and you're like, hold my beer, I mean, we have 900-year-old houses or whatever.
Yes.
So I wonder if you believe that kind of that sense of place, that area, does that inform your work, do you think? Because it's such a rich tapestry to play against?
Yes, very much so. And I actually believe that it's literally the geography of a place. It's the power of the place itself that somehow comes out of the energies of the earth, if you like. I believe that absolutely influences the spirit of place, if you like. The environment itself, the climate, of it, and literally the topography of places, I think, very much influence it. And I think if you try and erase it, it usually ends in disaster of some kind. Or the place I grew up, you see, and this was something I was haunted by as a kid,
right?
Because it was on the fringes of London and the county of Essex. Well, you probably know that in the Second World War, the East End of London was bombed very badly,
right.
And parts of it almost obliterated. And so, of course, after the war, a lot of new housing had to be built, and a lot of people were displaced. And what happened was they moved them out several miles out onto the fringes of Essex and just built without any consideration, quick as possible, to get new housing for the people that needed them. And as a result of that, the place where I grew up had been obliterated. There was really almost none of it left, except little scraps of marshland. Because it's near the Thames, there still is in places a lot of marshland. And it had this feeling to me as a child of a place smoldering with anger because it, it had just been overlaid by concrete and tarmac. And that did haunt me as a child. And I think even now, if you go back, it's even more depressed in a sense now, as the decades have gone by, than it was then. It has a feeling of something brooding with displeasure for having been squashed, if you like, without any thought at all. I mean, it could have been done more sensitively, but at the time, of course, there was just no prospect of that because of the speed with which it was done.
Right.
But here, where I live now, it's very much full of history. I mean, ancient stones and buildings, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I've done some traveling. I haven't been to Wales. I actually took a car journey from Scarborough Castle all the way through the Lake District to Blackpool. It was lovely. It was lovely because you stopped at all kinds of incredible places, and actually I kept thinking, oh, these castle ruins is where I might get a vibration, but actually in the countryside I got kind of a vibration as well, if you will. Yeah.
Oh, they were full of Britain is full of places like that where the place itself seems to have a character, is a presence, a person, a force and a presence, and that does fascinate me, and very much. I hope it comes across in the Glasswater Quintet. It's certainly, that's what I would have intended.
Well, and I do want to talk about the books, but I want to ask you one more question, if I may, straight up. So maybe you've already answered it, but do you believe in ghosts then, James?
I do believe that people can be influenced by the energies of people that have passed, yes. Now, how that may manifest itself is another matter altogether.
Right.
I have certainly met people who I have spoken to mediums. I've had conversations with mediums, and I have, for instance, once when I was a student at drama school, I think somebody thought of it as a bit of a laugh. I think there's a spiritualist centre in the middle of London in Bloomsbury, and they said, oh, let's all go and sit there and, we can have a bit of a giggle, So we went along to this spiritualist meeting, and I was sitting on the end of the road by the aisle, and suddenly this lady, to my absolute horror at the time, just said, that young gentleman sitting on the end there, and pointing straight at me, and sort of, I was completely aghast. She said, I can see behind you. At this time, I was, of course, living in London. And as I said, I'd been brought up on the edges of London. And she said to me, behind you, I can see a beautiful Welsh vista. And there is a lady standing behind you, holding out her arms in front of it. And that was the first thing she said. And of course, it went on, and she said other things. And I began to get a bit freaked in the end. And in the end, she said to me, I'm going to have to stop now because you're blocking me. She could sense it. She could sense the fact that I was actually getting a bit tense about it, because I was very young at the time. But anyhow, that stuck in my mind because it, of course, years later, I did end up coming to live in Wales, and there was, and my mother was Welsh, you see, and so of course there was that connection. Whether this person she said that she saw was any sort of family connection, I really don't know, but it was extraordinary because there was nothing. I mean, she didn't know me from Adam. So those people clearly can see. Well, now, whether they are actually literally seeing somebody standing behind you, or whether the image presents itself in their mind, which I suspect is nearer the truth, but where that image comes from, how it is conveyed from some supernatural dimension, how that's conveyed through the mind of the medium so that it can then be related, I have no idea. But I've spoken to people, of course, whenever you see mediums portrayed certainly on film and television, they're nearly always made out to be either ludicrous or crooks. And of course there are charlatans. There's no point in trying to pretend there aren't. Of course there are, but the people that I have met are not people who ever charge for it. They're just ordinary people who do it if people ask.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of the key too, is that I adhere to a lot of Penn Jillette says often that he has an intense dislike and hatred for people who charge you money to allegedly talk to your
Yes.
loved ones, and he's done a
Yes.
lot like Houdini did back in the day. He's busted a lot of these. Of course, the Amazing Randy did the same. He's busted a lot of these people who clearly they used microphones to listen outside the lobby, and then
Yes.
people come in, and then they ask all these very leading, cold reading type questions. But what you're saying, see, that's the thing, because I'm very rational, yet I have this streak in me that is the door is open for me, which is
Yes.
interesting because you talk about the door between the natural and the spiritual world here. So, but
Yes.
my point being, I think it would be a shame to be so rational as to believe that there's nothing special otherwise.
Yes, I think we'll all die of rationality if we're not very careful. Actually, I think at the end of it, it's going to be a big black hole. I think. I mean, science, of course, is wonderful and achieves wonderful things. I mean, as we've all experienced recently with these amazingly quickly produced vaccines and so on.
Amen.
Of course. But I think if you relied solely on that, we're going to actually wither away if we're not very careful. I really do think that. I think there has to the other side of it, the inexplicable will always be inexplicable. And once we think we've solved something, it will the goalposts will move, and there will be something else we don't understand because it's just shifted out of the way and gone somewhere else. But I think that'll always trip us up.
I think I love that, by the way. Yeah, death by rationality. But I think that for me, because I'm as we all are all, I think we're all, well, maybe not all, maybe actually no. I know not all humans are questing these things. I know not all humans think about these things, but I'm just thinking about as I get into my past my middle age that what's next and what will it be like. And then when I think about how we spoke to it, that's kind of where I was going with my earlier questions is,
yes,
okay, if we are seeing some kind of thing or is it just kind of a imprinted recording of energy from a past life, perhaps? I really don't know if I believe in the ghost who is just thinking and really coming at you and trying to scare you necessarily. I just wonder if these aren't echoes or energy like that.
Oh yes, I can't imagine a ghost wanting to scare people. I think they may want to convey something. If there were, I mean, some people will talk about trapped spirit and that sort of thing. I've heard that referred to, and of course that is a feature of the first book in the series. But I can't imagine what on earth. I think they've got better things to do than worry about scaring us. I mean, honestly, why would they? I mean, they've been through an awful lot. They've been into this world and out of it again. Why would they worry about whether they scare us or not? They would have something to impart, of some kind. Right. And and sometimes I think there are certain people who, for whatever reason, become either by a genetic disposition towards being very open to it, or become open to it often through some kind of psychic disturbance. I mean, this is why it's very commonly associated with adolescence, the disturbance of adolescence. People often become very particularly sensitive to these kinds of things, but also people who are suffering. This is where it becomes tricky, because if you're talking about somebody who may be suffering a degree of mental illness, for instance, well then, is this just psychotic? And there you get into a very difficult area, of course. Is it just an hallucination? But on the other hand, I do think people do become more sensitive when their defenses are down, for whatever reason.
Well, as you say, in extremis, the future will feed on the past as we get into On the Edge of Wild Water. Let's talk about these stories. Okay. I'm fascinated by how you're drawing upon these things. So let us in a little bit, if you don't mind. Of course, I know you won't spoil anything, but let us in a little bit. What should readers start to see when they open the pages here?
I think I would hope that they would be drawn in by atmosphere and a sense of urgency. Yeah. Although it's not what you would normally be described as a fast-paced book now, in as much as it's not wham bam on every single page.
Right.
Nonetheless, I think there is a sense of urgency in the way that the story is told, which I would hope would draw people in. So although it's a bit of a slow burn, it becomes quite a compelling slow burn. That's what I would hope.
I think so. And these books, readers good, right around 300 pages. So it's a good. It may not be, as he says, a roller coaster thrill ride every second,
No,
but it's atmospheric. It's moody. It's got all that stuff. You really do paint the picture so well. But it's also not one of those books that seems to go on interminably because
no, no,
there's some authors need to understand that 500 pages is a lot of investment for people,
no,
whereas 300 isn't.
no. And sometimes they go on quite inordinately. I mean, somebody once wrote a book about moles after the success of Watership Down, and it went on for about 600 pages. Now, who needs to read 600 pages about moles? But anyhow, no, I do.
Moles.
Yes, quite. I would also say that my books are quite emotional and quite dramatic, and they usually have a dramatic denouement, which I hope is a little bit worth working towards. And yeah, that's what I would say. They do have a sense of drama and a strong emotional dimension to them.
Yeah, and as I say, they're part allegory, part naturalistic drama,
Yes.
but they also feature a strong, as we discussed, strong element of psychological mystery.
Yes.
But you anchor it, though, in the real world with
Yes.
characters people can identify with, right?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. That's very important to me. I'm not interested in, I've never even thought about creating some sort of fantasy world, which isn't an alternative universe or anything like that. I'm very much interested in as I say, these other dimensions in the world that we live in. That really interests me.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's it. You go.
I would love to talk to you just briefly, if you would. And I know that you do a lot of interviews, and it may be a tedious question. Maybe this will be my only tedious question. Okay. As you may or may not know, this show, we have many, many readers, of course, who listen, but we also have writers. We have people who are various stops along their writing journey, whether they're brand new or they've written several. We've got a lot of mid-listers and who listen. I'd love to know, okay, here we go. It's tedious. I'm asking anyway. I'd love to know your process. I'd love to know, do you write quickly? How do you write? Is there a certain time? I'd love to just have a window into your world.
Right. It's not tedious at all. I wish I could be more definite about it. One thing I can say is I have a very vague idea about the track of a novel before I start it. I roughly know who the characters are going to be, what are the various, what is obviously the main thrust of the plot, plus any perhaps subplots that go with it. And I usually have a very clear idea about the dramatic climactic denouement. But how I then get to that point is usually a complete mystery. I actually start writing it and see what happens. And so it's not very fast because so far I've always had other things to do during the day. One of the things I've always tried to stick to is what is for me a realistic word count in a day, which is about 500 words, which is not a lot, but if you stick to that every day, it will very soon mount up into something considerable. But you have to be very disciplined about that. I don't write because I'm a terror. I know that many writing manuals will say, don't go over what you've written, it will hold you back, just keep going. And I actually think that's probably on the whole quite good advice, but I'm afraid I can't follow it. I obsessively go back constantly and edit what I've written and rewrite it and try to get it better. And certainly sometimes if you're trying to reflect somebody's state of mind or a particularly difficult emotional moment, then you have to be, it's actually quite difficult to put into words. And so you have to be very careful about the words that you choose to try and convey as clearly and as interestingly as possible. So there are sometimes, in all the books that I've written, there are usually, half a dozen places that I've literally gone back to and back to and back to and back to till I'm absolutely sick to death of them. And eventually it comes out right. So I don't have a formula. I don't have a template, which might be disappointing for people who might want to know how to go about writing a novel. But I honestly think in truth that you can't really tell anyone how to do it. You can offer tips, but you can't really tell anyone how to do it. So I have a vague outline, dramatic end, but how to get there, I don't know. And I will, it's like going through a dark tunnel or a tunnel with a very faint light and having to find your way out the other end.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot.
Mm.
And of course, loving the journey. But I find when I'm sitting down, I do 500 to 1,000 words per session usually. But then there's some sessions where I go crazy, and there's 2,500, and I look up and I'm like, when did that happen?
Oh, yes, that happens. That happens to me too. So one day I'll do 1,500, and another time, I might, if there's something comes up during the day, you just can't, and it might actually only be 250 or something.
Yeah.
But
I often look at those days though when I don't get to the writing as the days I miss the gym. I castigate myself for not going to the gym or for not writing certain days. But sometimes life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans, as John Lennon famously said. But so I was going to ask you though, so you kind of talk about. Do you think that's a phenomenon of? I assume you write on a computer then.
Oh, yes, I do.
Is that a phenomenon of the modern age, though, that we writers, it used to be, my grandfather who wrote for 50 years, he's now gone, he banged it out on an old Smith Corona,
yes, I know.
and maybe a notepad, but he didn't touch it again until he went to the next pass at the entire finished work. Whereas for me, James, I don't know about you, but for me, I'll sit down and reread what I did yesterday to remember what I was doing, because I always like to leave it at a spot where I can easily jump back in.
Yeah.
And while I'm rereading from yesterday, I'm tinkering with everything already.
Oh yes,
so,
I do that all the time, and absolutely, I've often thought in some ways, I'm a bit of a technophobe. I don't embrace every aspect of technology, but I cannot imagine going back pre-computer now in terms of writing, simply because of what you say. I change so much all the time. Anything I would be writing down, or even on the typewriter, would have so many alterations, it would just be impossible. And when I look back at writers before the age of computers and so on, you do see manuscripts, don't you? You see excerpts from manuscripts of classic novels and so on, and you can see that they have crossed out and altered and written, an alternative sentence above and all that kind of thing. But even so, I think I would be doing it so much that it's impossible.
You kill a forest. I mean, you could potentially kill a whole forest of trees.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I found I've gotten, James, to the point where I will do that, but once I get the first draft done, and that's after tinkering with it all the way through, so technically it's probably 1.5 drafts if you really think about it, I will print that out, and then I will mark that up and then go back, because I need to see it on paper. I think it helps, because I think you get a little copy blind looking at the screen. So I'll print it out and I'll do that. I'll go back and I'll make those changes, and then I ship them off to my editors. So I've got a copy editor and a developmental editor, and they both have their passes at it. But it's I do miss the nostalgia, because I have all my grandfather's papers, and I have those manuscripts. So I love looking at these yellowing and all the mark throughs and things.
No, but that's a fantastic thing to have.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a fantastic family legacy. Well, they published his work.
Oh, absolutely. He wrote westerns. He wrote westerns. Yeah, he was.
What was his name?
You wouldn't have heard, but his name was Robert E. Trevathan, and he also had a pen name. But he started in the 40s in the western pulps. I don't. Over my shoulder, I've got a few. Oh, go ahead.
My dad would have loved him. He was a western fan. So.
I run into that often. It's kind of sadly fading out.
Yes.
And listeners, forgive me a minute. You can go have a quick cup of coffee while I tell James this. Go refill your coffee, but because most listeners who have heard the show know this, but I discovered when I was moving house a few years ago a manuscript that he'd given me years ago to look at. And I used to run a small town newspaper, and so I was serializing it chapter by chapter in our weekly newspaper. And people loved it. I was in Oklahoma. I don't know if you know much about the United States, but that's a very cowboy-specific type place. Well, I found it, and I realized this is grand. I have this manuscript that never got published. It was like one of the last he did, and his agent didn't think it was going anywhere or whatever. Well, the first chapter or two were missing. Lost in the sands of time somehow. So I wrote those chapters, and then I went back and was his editor, and then I just on my own published it through Amazon. And I can finally say that I've written a book with my beloved grandfather. But it's interesting. Just I say that too because about the state of the Western in the market is. Just sales are just pretty anemic for Westerns in general. It's not just because nobody's heard of me. I've just looked into the market. It's pretty weak, which is sad. But the one market that is not faded out is your market. I wonder, do you do any, or did you prior to lockdown? Did you do any appearances, any readings? Did you engage with your fans a little bit?
I've done as many readings as I could. Of course, there were always launches in those days when you had physical launches, and I usually had very generous people who would help me stage those. And I did one launch in London as well, because I've still got some contacts there, which is nice. And a friend of mine ran an arts club, mainly for actors, but I was able to do a launch there. So I absolutely, and I enjoy it. I mean, because I started off as an actor, so I enjoy doing that. So I love to do it, as often as I get the invitation to do so. I do love it. Yes.
I have a bit of an acting background myself. I wonder how does those two things square as a writer? The performative aspects of out there on the stage, literally. How does that inform your writing? Do you think, being an actor?
Well, I certainly think from the point of view of your last question, it is a huge asset, and I feel very lucky because a lot of writers find reading torturous,
Right.
and actually aren't always very good at it. And it has to be said that sometimes they would be better off getting somebody else to read stuff. But I feel very blessed in that way. I feel very lucky. That I don't have too much of a problem. So there's that aspect. In the work itself, I think it influences my work on two levels. One is the dialogue, because people have commented that there is quite a lot of dialogue in my work, and that people are usually very nice and say it's very convincing and it works very well. So I think that comes from a dramatic background, because I'm used to using dialogue, of course, in dramatic terms, and also literally the dramatic set piece, if you like. There are confrontations in it. There are very dramatic, as I say, endings to the novels usually, which I think must come from a sense of drama that is inherent in me. It just does.
I agree, and I frankly, as a writer who features a lot of dialogue, I wonder if that's part of the deal, because I think it's two things, by the way, for me at least, speaking for myself about that. One, I was an actor, yes, but two, I'm very influenced by film and television,
Yes.
and I mean that's how you tell stories is the
Yes.
dialogue, right? So I do love that about your work too. Uh, as we sadly get close to the end here, I would like to ask you just a couple more questions, though.
Yes, of course.
Please forgive me for going so deep a dive into everything behind your books. I would be remiss
No,
if we didn't. Is that
I don't mind it at all. I find, this is great.
okay?
Go for it.
Okay. Well, but we need to make sure we talk about the entire series as it stands. So we have On the Edge of Wild Water, and then we have the Glass Citadel, the Stone Forest, Eye of the Rushes, and the soon to be released the Ice Chandelier.
Well, yes, it's not soon to be released. It's still in progress.
Okay.
But the others, as you say, that is the correct order, and the others are all out. Yes. And it works in an unusual way, I suppose. It takes an anti-clockwise circular trajectory. So On the Edge of Wild Water is set roughly about the time it was written, which is in the 2000s. Then I had this idea that I could link two places that I knew best in life, which was here in West Wales and on the eastern side of the UK, and use places and some events that were true, and to work them into the fiction. But I thought it would be really interesting to go back in time and then forward again. So this Glass Citadel, which, as you say, is the second one, takes place in the 1970s, and the character of the father On the Edge of Wild Water is then a teenager in the Glass Citadel. And then it goes back further again to the beginning of the Second World War, which is the Stone Forest, and then forward again to the 1990s, which is when, the Eye of the Rushes is set partly in the 1990s, and also it has an historical dimension in the 1890s, exactly 100 years before. But basically it goes forward to the 90s again, and the characters become younger and then age again. And I find that an interesting process. I think this whole circular aspect of life, I think as you get older, you begin to recognize that a bit more. And the Ice Chandelier will take place a few years after the events of the first novel. So you come back full circle and a little bit more. So.
this reminds me so much of a previous guest, Canadian author Jason McIntyre, who wrote something called the Dovetail Cove series. It's 10 books, but he does that. He says you can start anywhere you want in these. Now
Yes.
that may, I don't know if that's the case with your series. He tells people you don't have to go to book one and go all the way to the last book.
No.
And I've read, okay, and I asked him though this, and I'm going to ask you the same question, James, if I may. Isn't it fun as a writer though? Because I assume now I haven't, of course, I haven't read the whole series, but I assume since you're jumping through time like you're in a some kind of a TARDIS here, that you
Yes.
can kind of do you find yourself kind of putting Easter eggy things in certain books that kind of call back more to the other?
Yes, I love doing that, and so often they're not particularly significant. It's just a very nice thing to do. In the Stone Forest, the main character is a girl, actually very young, only about 13, who features as the principal character in the Stone Forest. And she seems to be quite a popular character from the feedback I've got. And then the following book, which, as I say, is in the 1990s, she is referred to in the book, but doesn't, you think she's not going to appear, and then right at the end, in the last chapter, she makes an appearance, obviously as a much older woman. And somebody who read that said, I just was so moved by that. I almost cried when she appeared, because I won't give it away, but she has a reunion with somebody she hadn't seen for 50 years, So it's I love doing that sort of thing. It isn't particularly relevant to the plot of the
Right.
book, but
But
yeah. That's
But
it.
the fans love it. I've got my
Yes.
series. I'm on book 8, but I do some frequent callbacks, or I bring in a character that had just maybe a 2-page little minute in one book. 4 books later, I bring this person back, and they're
Yes.
like, "Oh my
Yes.
gosh, I remember
Yes.
him."
Yes.
There's something they call it fan service in the movies, where you're kind of,
Oh.
but I think they say fan service in a kind of a condescending way, and that's not at
Yes.
all what we're doing here, is it?
No, I haven't. I can honestly say that is not a term I've ever heard before, and I've never thought about it. It just pleased me to do it. It seemed to me a nice thing, and I think if I were reading something and if I had got into it, I would think, oh, how lovely. How lovely. There she is, and so that's it. I honestly never thought about it as being in any way playing up to anything. It seemed to me like a good thing to do. That's all.
Well, I think it's lovely. Again, just one more thing. As if you get this series completed, do you have something on the horizon past this that you can share, or not?
Yeah, well, there's something that's been cooking for literally decades, actually, with me. And I'll just tell you very briefly. Years and years ago, in a place where I used to live, there was a street market on one day, and I was wandering round, and there was a bric-a-brac stall. And on this bric-a-brac stall, I saw an old Edwardian autograph book of the kind that innumerable young ladies used to have in those days, where they kept pressed flowers in them, and people wrote lovely bits of verse, that they knew off by heart in those days, really classic verse, all beautifully written, of course. And it was one of those, and that sort of thing fascinates me. Again, it's a sort of relic of the past. It's like a living voice. Anyhow, I bought this just because I liked it, and took it home. And it wasn't until a while later that when I was going through it, when I discovered about 3 pages, that's all, in pencil, written by the person whose book it was, from inside a mental institution. And
Wow.
yes, and from this and this is another thing where I could embrace technology, with the help of technology, and a friend of mine who's very into genealogy. She's been immensely helpful, invaluable, actually. We have discovered a huge amount about this woman and her family from this. From the sparse details that appear in this, I now know a lot about this woman and her background, and it makes a fascinating story. Ordinary people, nothing remarkable about her.
Yeah.
But it's the story of a transition from rural Britain to the horrors of urban Britain, and the poor, that they were not wealthy people, the poor the horrors of the First World War, and so many women being left husbandless, of course, that either they were killed or they just never got to marry, and all of that, which has been much written about in many ways, but it could make either one very interesting novel, or even a trilogy or something like that. Or even a very good play, actually.
Oh yeah,
very good play.
Here we are again with your theme. The past, stepping stones to the future. Someone else's past who you found by chance,
yes.
And then you did this, and here you go, and your fertile mind has developed this.
Yes.
James, I hate to say it, the clock on the wall is telling me to. He's giving me the finger as it does, but I'd love it if clocks do have hands, so they might have fingers.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
It's Wordcatcher Publishing is your publisher, where you can get all these titles can be ordered directly from them, or
they can be, but your best the Kindle versions are obviously available on Amazon and almost any platform from whatever your preferred device is. But all the titles are available on Amazon. You'll find them on the Amazon US site, and that's probably the best place to order them. And if anyone wants to just look at them first and find out more about me, my website is probably the best place to go, which is James Morgan Jones, all one word, jamesmorganjones.co.uk. There you will find information about me and all the books as well.
And folks, don't be furiously scribbling while you're driving, or get off the treadmill at home, or whatever you're doing, because all you have to do is go to mgopod.com for the show notes, find the link. You'll find this episode, and you'll find all those links where you can find them. And James Morgan Jones, author of the Glasswater Quintet, Supernatural and Mystery. The past is the door. It opens both ways. And I would really recommend, folks, that you check out this gentleman's work. It is a delight. James Morgan Jones, thanks for joining us here on Mysterious Goings On.
You are very welcome. I've had a great time. Thank you for asking me.
This episode is brought to you by Spotify and Anchor, your source for the best in music, podcasts, and more. You can also be someone who helps bring more to your life with Mysterious Goings On by being a listener supporter. Please click on the link in our show notes, and you will be offered 3 tiers for support. We have a 99-cent per month tier, $4.99 per month, and $9.99 per month. You can buy it with Google Pay or use with a credit card instead. This helps keep the show going. I could use your support if you really enjoy Mysterious Goings On, and lots of you have since 2016. We'd love to keep going, and some listener support like you would be very, very helpful to me in keeping the show moving right along there. So, as I always say at the end of every show, keep reading, but also keep listening, and please consider supporting Mysterious Goings On. Thanks so much for listening to Mysterious Goings On. Don't forget, we have a complete archive of all of our interviews, monologues, updates, live readings, dead readings. All of that stuff is available at mgopod.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. Please join us there. Again, don't forget, mgopod.com also has links where to find me on social media and how to get in touch in case you want to be a guest here on the show. Well, I think it's time that I move on for this week, but until next time, keep reading.